All right. Again, thank you so much for joining us tonight. With that, I will pass the floor to Nathaniel to get us started for tonight's event. Nathaniel, the floor is yours.
All right. Thank you, Ren. And thank you to everybody who is here joining us this evening. We've got tons of people coming in as we speak. Welcome, everybody. We've got a lot of stuff to get through today. And so we're going to jump right into it. We are going to try to end right on time. We value your time. And as Ren mentioned, please, if you have any questions, put them in the Q&A, and we will also have a Q&A session towards the end. So I am going to start by sharing my screen here. All right. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Nathaniel Stinnett. I'm the executive director and the founder of the Environmental Voter Project. Ren Sinise, our organizing associate, is here, and I know many of you know her better than you know me because you're such amazing volunteers. Tonight, we are going to only give a very, very quick introduction to the Environmental Voter Project. If any of you are here because this is your first time learning about EVP, thank you for being here. But I do just want to warn you, this is not going to be an introduction to the Environmental Voter Project webinar. We will very, very quickly, in like 3 minutes, rush through it. But what we're going to spend the huge majority of our time on today is going over our results from 2022. What worked, what didn't work, what our short-term impact was, what our cumulative impact has been, some of our experimental data, and then we'll just give a peek at what's coming up ahead, and then we'll have a Q&A session. So without further ado, because we've got a ton to get into, let's go ahead and get started. In a nutshell, the Environmental Voter Project simply focuses on finding environmentalists who don't vote and turning them into better voters. That is it. That is what we do with the Environmental Voter Project. We find already persuaded, dyed-in-the-wool super environmentalists who don't vote, and then we turn them into consistent voters. Now, what that also means is we don't endorse candidates. We don't lobby for particular policies. We don't even try to persuade people to care more about climate change or other environmental issues. We are not in the mind-changing or opinion-changing business at all. We are solely in the behavior-changing business. What we're trying to do is bypass all that hard, expensive, messy stuff of politics that involves changing people's opinions and just find the people who don't need their opinions changed, they just need their behavior changed, so that we can then make a pure behavioral intervention to get these people to vote. We do this with a 4-step process. First, identification. We build sophisticated predictive models with data scientists on voter files that enable us to individually identify these super environmentalists who don't vote. That allows us to go to step number 2, mobilization. Once we can isolate these super environmentalists, well, we know then that we can be completely agnostic with our messaging with them, so long as we get them to vote. Because remember, we don't need to persuade them to care about climate change. They're already there. You shake them awake at night and they're going to scream climate change. The problem is they're just not getting out the door on election day. So that gets us to this step number 2, where we have thousands of volunteers around the country who canvass and call and send postcards to these voters. We as a staff also do digital ads and direct mail, all informed by behavioral science experiments and focused on just one outcome, and that is turning these non-voters into first-time voters. Then we go to step 3, habit reinforcement. Once we do get someone to vote for the first time, we don't ditch them until they become a consistent voter. And you don't need to be a behavioral scientist to be able to figure out that you can't build up someone's habit by only talking to them every 2 or 4 years when there's a big, sexy federal election going on. So we take this third step, habit reinforcement, very, very seriously. Whenever there is an election, no matter how small, we try to use it as a behavioral intervention opportunity to change these non-voting environmentalists' habits. And I really mean any election. We're mobilizing people in county coroners races, in library trustees races. We've never done a dog catcher race yet, but believe me, we're looking. Like, we will use any election as an opportunity to change people's voting behavior. And then finally, the fourth step is this is how we truly build up political power in the environmental movement. This is how we change the electorate. Because nothing motivates a politician more than the prospect of winning or losing an election. And so they're always going to go where the votes are. The problem is right now, there are millions, and I really mean that, millions of already registered to vote super environmentalists who just don't show up. There were almost 13 million registered voters who skipped the most recent midterm election, who list climate and the environment as their top priority. That is a big, big problem that we are trying to solve. But through this four-step process, we are solving it, as you'll see in some of the data that we present tonight. We are currently operating in these 19 states. You'll notice that 2 of them are in yellow. That's because we just expanded into Louisiana and Nebraska last month. We've already been mobilizing voters in both states, and we're really, really excited to be in those 2 new states. All right, I told you it was going to be quick. If you want to learn more about the Environmental Voter Project, if this is new to you, please know that on our YouTube page, we have an entire, I think, 45-minute session followed by Q&A called Introduction to the Environmental Voter Project. And we can put a link in the chat. If you're new to EVP and what I just said is interesting to you, please go and learn more about why we do what we do, how we do it, and some of the results that we've gotten in the past. If you want to know about some of the results that we got last year, though, stay on the line. There's now almost 100 of you. Stay on the line because we've got some great information for you. All right. Last year, so just in 2022, we ended up contacting 2,349,692 voters. We have them all tagged in the voter file. We know exactly who they are. Many of them we contacted multiple times in multiple ways. We knocked on their door. We sent them a postcard. We sent them a bunch of direct mail and digital ads, and we called them. We had almost 400,000 full phone conversations. We sent over 130,000 volunteer postcards. I'm going to get into that a bit more. And almost 550 volunteers sent those postcards. Over 2.1 million direct mail pieces and almost 100 million digital ad impressions, all focused on these 2.3 million already registered to vote super environmentalists who we could see from public voter files had never voted in a midterm election before. So we knew these were people who needed this purely behavioral intervention. So this is who we targeted last year in 2022. For those of you, and I think the overwhelming majority of you on the line right now, for those of you who donated to the Environmental Voter Project, for those of you who volunteered your time and your effort and your expertise to the Environmental Voter Project, these are the people who we actually reached. So I'm not talking about the people who were on our list and we hope to get them if they'd only pick up their phone or answer their door. No, these are the people we actually ended up communicating with. And we know who they are by name and street address on the voter file. And before I get to how we measure our election-specific results, I told you I wanted to dig a little bit deeper on volunteer postcarding. Thanks in large part to my colleague Ren, who is on the line right now, we had an amazingly successful launch of our volunteer postcarding program last year. As many of you know, we resisted doing volunteer postcarding for probably 2 years. A lot of you were asking us, come on, how come you're not doing postcarding? We really want to do it. I think we had a really good reason for not doing it. And that was because we devour all of the political science and behavioral psychology and behavioral economics experiments that are out there. And for years, we had not seen a single randomized control trial telling us that volunteer postcarding actually increased turnout 1 iota. There were a few experiments that showed an increase, but even those weren't statistically significant, which very briefly just means the numbers involved weren't big enough that you could be certain of those outcomes. You could be certain that they weren't just due to random occurrence. And so we looked at all this and we thought, I don't think we want to ask our volunteers to do this unless we know the right messaging and the right people to target so that we can assure them that we're optimizing the likelihood that their time really will matter. Well, by the end of 2021, we started to see some of those statistically significant results. And so we let the data change our minds. We saw that there were ways to do this and have them be impactful. And so we started doing them. And you'll see we had almost 550 volunteers send over 130,000 postcards in 4 different elections last year. And as you'll see in some of the data that I'm going to present a little bit later, we got statistically significant proof that EVP was solely responsible through our postcarding efforts for increasing turnout of these low propensity environmental voters. We know it. We have proof that it worked. And for all of you who are listening to this right now, who were part of those postcarding efforts, I hope you're patting yourselves on the back. I know it takes a lot of time and effort, but I'm very, very proud that we can report back to you and say, we have proof that you created new votes. All right. Before I get into the data, I know I've said before I do this many times already, but before I get into there, I'm going to very, very quickly explain to you how we measure our impact in specific elections. And it has to do with these randomized control trials that I've already referenced. A few of you have seen this slide before and you've heard me talk about this, but it's so important that I hope you'll bear with me as I just repeat it again. What we do to measure our impact in specific elections is, first, we take our population of target voters. So let's say in the state of Pennsylvania, we've identified 1 million super environmentalists who are registered to vote, but they've never voted in a midterm. So we have to assume that they are unlikely to vote. All right, those are our targets. Except we actually don't reach out and try to communicate with all 1 million of them. Our next step is to randomly remove about 20% of them and set them aside in a control group. And what is special about that control group is that we never talk to them. The remaining 80%, in this slide, it's called an intervention group. Often it's called a treatment group. That remaining 80%, those are the ones we send postcards to, we call, we canvass, we mail, we send digital ads, all with behavioral science informed messaging optimized to turn them into new voters. But no one in the control group gets any messaging from us. Then the election happens. And a few months later, this magical thing occurs. And that is that public voter files get updated and we can see who voted and who didn't vote. Many of you have heard me say this hundreds of times, but it bears repeating. Who you vote for is secret. Whether you vote or not is public record. And so after we have communicated with this treatment group, but not with this group down here, the control group, the election happens, voter files are updated, and then we can see, oh, look at how many people voted in our treatment group. And let's compare that to how many people voted in our control group. And the magic in this approach is what it enables us to do is isolate what EVP's sole impact was on turnout while controlling for all outside variables. Because if it was raining in Pittsburgh and that depressed turnout on election day, well, between these two groups. Residents proportionately in our control group is in our treatment group. So we've controlled for that. That shouldn't matter. Well, you say, what about all these Senate races and gubernatorial races that are spending millions of dollars to turn out voters? Have you controlled for that? Well, yeah. There are just as many of their targets in our treatment group as in our control group. Unless those well-funded campaigns hacked into our system and decided to only target people in our treatment group, we've controlled for that. And so what using these randomized control trials allows us to do is figure out what increase in turnout we are solely responsible for. Or another way to put it is, what increase in turnout would not have happened if we had just decided to not get in the game. And that's the first set of data that I'm going to be presenting. What that also allows us to do, though, these randomized control trials, is isolate which messages work better than other messages to turn out these voters. And that's what I'm going to get into next. All right. In 2022, what you see here are our statistically significant results where we were able to prove that the Environmental Voter Project was solely responsible for increases in turnout over our control group. Now, I want to be clear. This does not mean that we didn't increase turnout in dozens or even hundreds of other elections. We probably did. We just can't prove it with statistical certainty. My guess is we absolutely increased turnout in Nevada by a significant amount. But can we actually prove it in a way that would pass peer review? No, we can't. We can't. But in these elections, we can. And you'll see the light green ones, those were statewide primaries. We increased turnout over 3.5 percentage points in that Alaska congressional special, that statewide special that brought Mary Peltola into Congress. We increased turnout almost 2 percentage points in the Arizona primary. Almost 1 percentage point in that very busy Pennsylvania primary, over 1% in Texas, in Florida, and Colorado. And then in the general elections, where billions, yes, literally billions of dollars were spent in last fall's midterm elections, we were still able to isolate what the Environmental Voter Project did with just $3.5 million in Texas, New York, and Colorado. New York, the state that probably decided control of the House of Representatives. There was a lot of money spent in Texas, a lot of money spent in New York, a lot of money even spent in Colorado. But amidst all of that, not only did we increase turnout, but we could prove with statistical certainty how much all of our efforts collectively, all of you volunteers, all of you donors, our staff, what our efforts did while being able to control for all outside variables. And I hope you all feel really, really proud of this. These are big numbers in this business. Very, very big numbers. 1.4 percentage points in a state like Florida, 1.2 percentage points in a state like Texas. We're extraordinarily proud of these numbers, and I hope that all of you are extraordinarily proud of them, because this really is, I know it sounds hokey, but it's a team effort. You all know that we couldn't do this without volunteers. You all know that we couldn't do this without donations. And so I hope you take pride in these results. All right. As many of you know, we don't just measure our impact in one-off elections. Because remember, when I walked through that 4-step process of what we do with the Environmental Voter Project, well, we also care about habit reinforcement. And then the 4th step was changing the electorate. What we want, what our ultimate goal is to so dramatically increase the amount of political power that the environmental movement has, that politicians running up and down the ballot across the country are looking at their voter files and looking at their polls and saying, holy moly, where did all these environmental voters come from? Because that political power is the crucial missing ingredient that we have to address the climate crisis and toxic air and toxic water and environmental racism and biodiversity, all of the great environmental crises that we face today. The huge missing link is political will and political power. So we don't just look at our isolated impact in one-off elections. We also want to know how much are we growing the environmental share of the electorate whenever there's an election. We have now been working, I can't believe I'm saying this, for 7 years. At the very end of 2015, we launched a one-state pilot program in Massachusetts. Then in 2017, we expanded into 5 more states. In 19, we expanded into 6 more states. Then we expanded into 5 states in 2021, and we just expanded into 2 more states, as I just mentioned. And that whole time, whenever we speak to someone, we tag them in our voter file because we want to track them. And as of about 6 weeks ago, we could see in the latest round of updated voter files that the Environmental Voter Project has now communicated with 9,542,183 unique people. These are all unique individuals. Now, many of them we've communicated with 5, 6, 7 times over lots of different communications channels. Some of them we've only communicated with once. But what we know is, remember what I said earlier, whether you vote or not is public record. What we know is that as of this most recent voter file update, 1,487,733 of them are now voting so consistently that they voted in their most recent federal election, so that's the last midterm, their most recent state election, so that's last year's primary, and their most recent local election that didn't coincide with one of those 2. They are now consistent super voters, almost 1.5 million. Now, I want to be clear here because we're very precise when we're talking about our experiments and our results. This metric, even though we are extraordinarily proud of it, I want to be clear, it is different from a randomized control trial. We cannot claim that we are solely responsible for turning 1.5 million non-voters into super voters. But boy, are we pretty darn responsible. There aren't any other groups that are mobilizing these environmentalists to vote in county coroner races and dog catcher races and library trustee races. We've already been involved in 90 elections in 2023. This year-round, every election approach in our states is how we start getting gaudy numbers like this. And this is how we build true political power. And just to give you some context of some of these numbers, because I'm sure many of you are looking at some of the state-specific numbers, well, let me tell you, what does 227,000 new environmental super voters mean in a state like Pennsylvania? Well, we've highlighted 6 states here. You could see in Nevada, where we've helped create over 33,000 environmental super voters, well, that is the size of the presidential margin of victory in 2020 in Nevada. The US Senate margin of victory in Nevada was only 9,000. And look at the context in Arizona. Even in a place like Alaska, we've only been working for 2 years. The number of super voters we have helped create there. So these are people who we were only targeting because they were awful voters. By definition, you've got to be an awful voter if the Environmental Voter Project is talking to you. And these 7,334 super environmentalists are now consistent voters. And we're very proud to have been a part of that. That was more than the margin of victory in the 2022 congressional race there, the statewide congressional. And I won't go through every state, but you can see Pennsylvania, much larger than the presidential margin. Virginia, much larger than the gubernatorial margin. Georgia, larger than the US Senate margin in 22 and the 20 presidential margin. Now, again, unlike randomized control trials, I am not going to claim that EVP is solely responsible for these results, but we are a big, big part of them. Not just because we're the only organization really doing all of these low turnout local elections, but because if you get someone to vote for the first time in a local election, it only takes a few months for the record of them having voted to show up on public voter files. And that means we're sending a signal to the rest of the progressive ecosystem saying, hey, look, this person just voted in a city council race. Go get them. And then the cavalry comes in. And all of these other campaigns see all these voters who we've stuffed into the pipeline, and they start turning them out at no cost to us. This is how we not only at EVP have a cumulative impact, but about how we're able to catalyze the beginning of a really, really exciting positive feedback loop where we help get someone to vote for the first time that shows up on the voter file, and then more and more groups end up helping to turn them out. And perhaps more importantly, politicians actually start polling them to figure out what issues they care about. And everybody who we get to turn out to vote is going to say climate change or the environment, because that is their number one priority. All right. I hope you all also take an enormous amount of pride in these cumulative impact numbers. All right. For more on our results, please take a moment now, tomorrow, this weekend, to check out environmentalvoter.org/results. We have tons of data up there. We have an interactive map of the United States where you can click on the various states where we work and see how many voters we've contacted and what elections we've gotten results in. We have so much data on our website, it's absurd. But please check it out, because you have self-selected that you're all political data nerds simply by being on this webinar. So I imagine you will enjoy it. So please go and check that out. All right, what's next? As I mentioned, these randomized control trials are useful not just because they let us figure out where we can prove that we had an impact and report back to our volunteers and our donors. They're also useful because we can experiment with particular messages. And so often we will clear the decks in an election and we'll say, nope, we're not going to do calls. We're not going to do direct mail. We are only going to test postcards, or we're only going to test phone calls, so that we can test particular messages, because we really are not just a full-time year-round voter turnout group. We're a full-time year-round voter turnout laboratory, trying to figure out which messages work best with which subgroups of our voters to get them activated and get them to start voting. I'm not going to go over all of our experiments this evening, but I am going to go over 3 that we did last year, 2 that were successful and 1 that wasn't successful. Yes, we are not always successful, and we don't want to hide our failures. We want to share them so that people can learn from them, and so that we can be transparent and let you know that we try things, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. All right. In the past, so starting in 2021, we started to get great results with what's called loss aversion mail. This might sound familiar to some of you because we started getting excited about it after this series of 2021 local elections. Very briefly, what the psychological concept of loss aversion is that people hate losing things. We hate losing things so much that in most behavioral psychology experiments, people would much rather or are much more scared of like losing $5 than they are excited by getting $5. We are just very averse to the idea of losing value that we already have. That is a much more powerful sensation to many of us than just getting something. Picking up $5, yeah, that's okay. Ooh, noticing that someone like lost my $5, that's awful. We are averse to losses like that. So the way we wanted to take advantage of that is we had a whole bunch of people heading into last year's midterms who we knew voted in presidential elections, but no other elections. So that meant they were in our target universe. There are some people in our target universe who never vote. There are others who are just unlikely to vote because they never vote in that particular election. So this was a huge population of what's called drop-off voters, people who vote in presidential elections, but not midterms. And because we had some limited resources and we thought older people are more likely to read mail, we only targeted people who were 30 years old and up. Simply by sending this one mail piece, we increased turnout almost 1 percentage point over our control group. That is a big deal. Ask Donald Trump how big a deal 0.8 percentage points is in the state of Pennsylvania. It is everything. It is everything. This is something that we did. Yes, it was in a statewide primary, but that was a big primary. You might remember the 2022 US Senate primary, the Democratic primary, was very, very, it was a lot of money was spent. It was a lot of volunteers were involved. And so the fact that we could isolate our impact just on this one mail piece, just one mail piece, was truly extraordinary. And this is what it looked like. We said, thank you for voting in 2020. Don't ruin your good voting record in 2022. The idea was we wanted to use loss aversion. We didn't want to make the act of voting for the first time in a midterm election seem like this new thing that we had to convince people to do. Instead, we wanted to endow them with something of value and then scare them that they might lose it. So what was that thing of value? We said, you just voted. You voted. You are starting a good new voting record. Yay, way to go. Thank you for voting in 2020. Now don't screw it up. Don't lose it. Don't ruin this thing of value that you are now creating. And then on the back, we gave them some very basic facts. We did remind them that who they vote for is secret, but whether they vote is public record. We, doubled down on the loss aversion. Keep your good voting record in 2022. And as I said, this had a 0.8 percentage point increase in turnout over our control group. That was statistically significant. This was a real result that we know with at least 95% certainty was not due to random occurrence. This was a statistically significant result. That is exciting in and of itself. But what gets really exciting is when we drill down underneath this and look at what's called some of the crosstabs, some of the demographic subgroups. We noticed that among African-American and Asian voters, and I'm going to use the demographic terminology that is in voter files, even though it's kind of antiquated. We had too few people to get really robust, statistically significant results. So that's why that's in light green, even though this number is pretty high. What was really exciting was this. Now, we saw an increase in turnout among Hispanic voters of 2.3 percentage points over our control group. Now, because it was such a small group that we were targeting, so Hispanic voters who were in our target population, it had a lower degree of statistical certainty. It was at a 90% level, but we were still really, really happy with that, because what this tells us is we need to find more opportunities to see if this is something that does have an oversized impact among Hispanic voters. The second thing that we realized was all of those great results when we said we increased turnout 0.8 percentage points, it actually all came from the guys. We increased turnout 1.4 percentage points among men when compared to men in our control group, whereas we had no statistically significant increase in turnout among women. Now, we have other techniques that actually do disproportionately well among women, but this is enormously important data. I mean, what this tells us is We could just mail all guys over 30 with this mail piece and get twice the impact. Or we could have just spent half the money and gotten the same impact. Another just piece of like sort of voter file terminology, I want to be clear. Voter files don't track gender. And so we only have sex identifiers in voter files, and that's only male and female. Obviously, there is more than that along the gender data set, but we don't have access to that. So I do just want to be clear about why I'm using that terminology. All right, this was one really interesting finding. Second thing, I mentioned volunteer postcards. I already gave you the history of why we didn't want to do that before, but we experimented in Colorado. We sent postcards to almost 80,000 people in the Colorado state primary. We increased turnout 1.3 percentage points over our targets. Again, we used a little bit of loss aversion. We said, thank you for voting in 2020. We were only going for these drop-off voters. And then on the back, this was pre-printed, but this is what the volunteers wrote. Thanks for being a good voter. Keep your good voting record. We really pushed this loss aversion messaging. And we increased turnout 1.3 percentage points over our control group just with this one teeny tiny little postcard. That's it. Now, to be clear, this doesn't mean that we would get the same results in a presidential general election. In fact, I am almost certain we would not, because it's harder to increase turnout in higher turnout elections like that. But what this does give us comfort in, and what I hope gives you comfort in as volunteers and as donors, is that this is a very powerful, high return, cheap intervention. We are really, really happy with that result. All right, final thing, because I know this is a ton of data, but I want to get through it in time that we have time for a few questions. I told you I was going to tell you something that didn't work. We experimented with digital ads in Florida during the general election when we only ran digital ads there. And what we wanted to do was test two different messages against a control group. We tested a norm enforcement message, and I'll describe what that means in a second, a face processing message, and then we had our control group that didn't get anything. It was a very, very robust 2-week digital ad buy across all of your devices whenever you're surfing the internet, but also Facebook and Instagram. All right, first we'll do norm enforcement. We had done some previous messaging that had showed us in experiments that this was a potentially powerful message. And the behavioral psychology that underpins this is, it's one thing to message to your voter target, you should do X, and X is some important social norm. Like you should be a good voter. You should wash your hands. You should wear a mask, something like that. It's another thing to actually deputize them as the norm enforcer. There's a lot of good research that shows that in and of itself is powerful at getting your targets to vote. You don't care about their friends and family. You just care about them. And so we could actually change their behavior by saying, hey, even though we all know that you're the one who's a bad voter, how about you make sure your friends and family vote? And in the past, we've had messages that have increased turnout using them. We tested that, and you're going to giggle at this, but we really wanted to test this. We tested that against a face processing message. There's a lot of really interesting research, not just among human beings, but among other species of primates, showing that we really have facial processing, so processing smiles, processing frowns, hardwired in our systems. There's a great experiment that I think took place in Britain, where they had those automatic speed limit signs that show you how fast you're going. And what they did was they all of a sudden added a little frowny face emoji, and people would like slam on their brakes and screech to a halt. Like it was enormously powerful. And so we wanted to use that. And we had this, and we also had some messaging about how voting makes you happy. There are some great medical studies that show that voting is a social determinant of health, but it also makes you happier and feel better about yourself. Anyway, we wanted to test this. Well, They didn't work. Maybe you think these weren't good ideas. Maybe you would have known, hey, you shouldn't have tested those. We thought they were worth testing. But you know what? Sometimes these messages don't work. Face processing didn't boost turnout one iota. Norm enforcement, our turnout group did have a 0.2 percentage point increase in turnout, but that was not statistically significant. So we can't be confident that that wasn't just due to random occurrence. We want to be honest with you about this stuff. We are a perpetual field laboratory. Usually we do most of our testing in primaries, not in generals, but we want to fine-tune our messaging and always optimize it so that we know that we are using your volunteer time in the best possible way, and we are using your donations in the best, most efficient, most high return possible way. All right. If you are we've got a little bit more research. Sorry, one more thing. Polling. We almost do no polling, but yeah, maybe like once every 2 years, we'll do some polling. Last year, we did polling in 4 battleground states. We found some really, really interesting stuff. For those of you who missed it, I just wanted to highlight 2 things. One, we realized yet again that there is not just a huge raw number of non-voting environmentalists, but in many states, including some crucially important states like Nevada and Pennsylvania, there are significantly more non-voting environmentalists than there are voting environmentalists. I mean, in Pennsylvania and Nevada, there are twice as many super environmentalists who are unlikely to vote as ones who are likely to vote heading into the midterms last year. And when you look at people who think that climate is, I'm sorry, I should have told you what this polling question was. These are people who think that climate change is a top priority when choosing a candidate. Look at the people in red here, the ones who say it's not important at all. Well, among likely voters, they outnumber the people who list climate as their top priority 3-1, 17-5. But it starts flipping among unlikely voters. And you see the same thing in Pennsylvania. Look at that. Among likely voters in Pennsylvania, there are 6 times as many people who say, yeah, climate isn't important at all when choosing a candidate, as there are people who say it's my single most important factor. But if instead you shift down to the people who are unlikely to show up, it completely evens out. This, again, highlights the enormous opportunity we have in the environmental movement and why our work, our collective work together at the Environmental Voter Project is so important. There is an enormous amount of latent political power out there for us if we just tap into it. What we were also able to figure out from this poll is very basic logistical information that helped inform a lot of our phone scripts and canvassing and mail and digital ads. We realized in the crucial battleground state of Pennsylvania, 1/4 of registered voters, we were only polling registered voters, 1/4 of them said, no, there is not early voting in our state. And there is, they were wrong. They were just wrong. And another third said, we're not sure. This is a very, very basic thing that can be changed with the right messaging to the right people. And so again, we don't do a lot of polling, but when we do, we try to not just focus on crazy horse race questions or things like that, but rather questions like this that can really inform our messaging and make sure that we're delivering the right messages to the right people. All right. If you would like more information on our research, things like these messaging experiments, things like what environmental voters and non-voters look like in all of our states, our polling data, please go to environmentalvoter.org/reports. We've got tons of reports up there. So again, please take a moment to visit there. All right, we're running out of time. I'm going to quick go to the finish so we can get to a Q&A. Please get back in the game and help us continue to make a difference. We are always contacting voters. We are canvassing in Austin and Pittsburgh and Tucson. We will be announcing our next postcarding campaign soon. Just in the next 2 weeks alone, we are phone banking for elections in Colorado, Florida, Massachusetts, Nebraska, and Texas. That's just in the next 2 weeks. If you would like to host your own Zoom event, please email me, nathaniel@environmentalvoter.org. I'll say it again, nathaniel@environmentalvoter.org. It's very easy if you want to get 10 or 15 of your friends together and learn about the Environmental Voter Project and have a nice long Q&A, not the 10-minute one we're going to have, but like a good 25-minute one. I would love to do it. And then finally, please take a moment to donate to support our work. I want to be just completely honest here. You are not here because you like supporting nonprofits as like a favor to them. Maybe you like us. I hope you like us, but I also hope that's not why you support our work. I hope that you support our work because you have this urge to make a difference. You have an urge to help address the climate crisis and to dramatically increase the amount of political power that we have in the environmental movement. And so I am unashamedly asking you to donate. If you donated last week, we'll do it again. If you haven't donated yet this year, please do so. Not as a favor to us, but as a favor to yourself. You care deeply about these things, and I can tell you, we are making a difference. We have the receipts to prove it. We are turning non-voters into new voters every day, and then we're turning those new voters into consistent voters every day. But the truth is, in odd years, people aren't as focused on elections. And this is when we need your support most, because this is when we can really cheaply, with really low conversion costs, turn these non-voters into voters. So we're going to get to the Q&A, but I just want to do one last thing here. Just coming up now in 5 weeks, there are 5 really significant elections that we are fundraising for. In El Paso, they are amending their city charter so that they can cut off water supply to most of the Permian Basin in Texas. This is an enormously high ROI opportunity. Jacksonville, Florida. Jacksonville is the largest city in the country with a Republican mayor. It's going to a runoff. This is a very, very important election in Florida's biggest city by far. Jacksonville's like twice the size of Miami. Philadelphia has an open mayoral primary. Allegheny County, where Pittsburgh is, has a county executive primary election, and the primary is going to decide it. They have siting control over many fossil fuel infrastructure pieces. And then the Colorado Springs municipal runoff election. They have a publicly owned utility there, so it's also really high ROI. Please support our work. We really want to make a big difference in these 5 elections. All right, we've got 10 minutes left for Q&A. I apologize. There was a ton of data, but I do want to get to your questions. And so I'm going to stop sharing my screen here. And Ren, what do we got for questions here?
Thank you so much, Nathaniel. And before I give you the questions, I just want to say thank you so much for everyone for posting your questions in the Q&A section and for being so engaged tonight. We really appreciate it. We have 3 questions. One is that, what is the most important thing EVP learned from 2022?
Yeah, okay. Most important thing we learned from 2022. All right. So we are obviously very proud of our ability to experiment and isolate these particular messages that work really, really well for particular subgroups of our voters. But the dirty, somewhat embarrassing truth is that no matter how smart we are, that is not nearly as important as just brutal repetition. We always get better results if we can talk to voters multiple times in multiple years. Always, always, always. And so we're obviously not going to stop trying to figure out the smartest messaging to deliver to the right people. But what we are continually learning, and what we learned a lot digging into our data last year, was that the best way to get these gaudy numbers, especially these great cumulative results, is to never skip an election, even if it's the lightest of touches. Because like you don't need to live this stuff. You don't need to be a behavioral scientist to understand that like you can't change habits by just talking to people once every 2 years. That's not how it works. Instead, you need to take every bite at the apple you can. And what we've realized in places like Georgia, where everything goes to a runoff, or Texas, where everything goes to a runoff, simply having more elections in which to talk to our targets makes it so much easier to change their habits over time. So that's important in this particular context to, again, stress the importance of 2023. Just because some of these elections might not be given 4 hours on CNN each night doesn't mean they aren't crucially important. Because I promise you, you're going to wake up 18 months from now scared to death about what's going to happen in the 2024 elections. And you're going to wish that you had been more invested in turning these non-voters into voters in 2023. This is when the magic happens, or at least when it happens at its cheapest.
Awesome. Thanks, Nathaniel. Okay, the second and third question is data-related one. So the second one is from Mary Jo. Do you worry that some people who want to skew your data list environment as their number one issue are not really concerned about the environment?
Very good question, Mary Jo. No, we're not that concerned. And the reason is they would have to be lying so incredibly consistently to so many different people that it's almost hard to imagine. So I know we didn't get into the nitty-gritty of how the Environmental Voter Project identifies our targets, but very briefly, it involves polling people, then cross-referencing the polling results of people who tell us that climate's their number one priority with all of this other data so that we can find other people like them. Then we build lists of all the people in a state who we think don't just care about climate and the environment, but it's literally their number one priority. And then we test that by calling the people on those lists to say, hey, what's your number one priority? Oh yeah, climate change, thought so, bye. And so once again, we test that. Then the third thing is whenever we build new models identifying these voters, we look back and we see how much change there has been, because we want to see, are certain people falling out of prioritizing the environment and who is newly prioritizing it. And we've never seen more than like a 7 or 8% drop off. And so what that really high degree of stickiness over time tells us, and the mere fact that these people are telling not just one pollster, but other pollsters the same exact thing, that climate change is their number one priority over all others, that gives us a really, really high degree of confidence that, that we're not being misled. However, I do want to be clear, Mary Jo, these predictive models are called predictive models because they deal in probabilities. We obviously have not had individual conversations with all 210 million registered voters in the United States of America. Of course we haven't. Instead, what we have done is we've had conversations with tens of thousands, figured out who lists climate and the environment as their top priority, extrapolated off that, had a long iterative process, and built essentially something similar to like an actuarial table that an insurance company builds. And it's very, very accurate. And We're very proud. Our volunteers often tell us, wow, this is the best data we've ever worked with. We love how accurate your data is. But is it 100% accurate? No, no. No voter targeting tool is 100% accurate. But we are very, very confident that every person we are reaching out to has at least an 85% probability of literally listing climate change as their number one issue over all others. But that's a great, great question, Mary Jo.
Thanks, Nathaniel. And for our last question, it's from Laurie. Are the results from the map graph just from postcarding or from the combination of all voter outreach tactics? I'm assuming this is from slide 12.
All right, Lori. Ren, can you see my slides again now?
Yes.
Great. So let's just pull up that map slide again so we know what Lori was asking about. Here, these are not just postcarding. So what this is mostly combined interventions. So this 1.4 percentage point thing in Colorado, that was just from postcarding alone. But some other things like the 1.2% in Texas during the general election, where like hundreds of millions of dollars were spent in Texas during the general election. No, what that is it's a combination of phone calls and direct mail and digital ads. It's a combination of these things. Usually, when we are mobilizing voters, especially in general elections, I don't want to say we're throwing the kitchen sink at it because we always, we always could raise more money. We could always have more volunteers. But usually these results that you see are from multiple interventions. However, in those isolated messaging experiments that I showed to you, so like this one, that was purely, the result that we got from that was purely from just this one mail piece. And this result in Colorado was just purely from this postcard. But that's a really, really good question. It's a really good question. All right. We stuck to our promise, which was to keep this to an hour. I've got 1 minute left, and I just want to make a final thank you and final pitch to all of you. First off, thank you. To those of you who volunteered and contacted voters, thank you so, so much. To those of you who volunteered and led phone banks and led postcarding parties and led canvassing shifts, thank you so, so much. To those of you who donated, thank you so, so much. We had over 9,400 donors last year, and we raised $3.5 million. But we did it an average of like $42 at a time. So much of that came from small donors, and a lot of it came from medium and big donors too. But thank you. I hope you take enormous pride in this. And then the final thing I'll just say is, again, you are here and you are part of our work for a reason. It is also the same reason that I am here. I want to make a difference. In particular, I want to dramatically and quickly build the political power of the environmental movement, because we are living at a crucially important moment in time where the only thing that is missing in most of these environmental crises is enough political power. So please, before we log off, take a moment to click on that volunteer link. It should be in the chat. Take a moment to click on that donate link. It should be in the chat. You can donate any amount. If you want to donate $1 million, we will take it. If you want to donate $10, we will take it. We love getting monthly donations because we work year round, so it's nice to get donations year round. And finally, please email me at nathaniel@environmentalvoter.org if you would like to introduce some of your friends over Zoom to the Environmental Voter Project. We don't require them to donate ahead of time. We will certainly ask them for donations, but we'll just discuss our work with them, and you'll get to introduce them to us, and we would love to do that. Thank you, Ren, for leading such a wonderful show. Thank you to all of you. My gosh, we had an amazing turnout here. Thank you all for being a part of this work. We look forward to hearing more questions from you, and we look forward to seeing you on the doors and writing postcards and on phone banks. Have a good night, everybody.